welcome back to the Open Metaverse Podcast. I'm your host today, Luca from the Animoca Brands portfolio team. And I have to say, I'm really excited and have been really looking forward to this specific conversation with Manuel Stotz from the TON Foundation, president of the TON Foundation, and someone whose journey from finance to frontier markets to Web3 is really as fascinating as it gets. Manuel, thank you for being here. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Luca. I really appreciate that you having me on the show.
Of course, 100%. So maybe before we get actually into TON directly, I'd love to start with yourself because you had such an interesting journey from Goldman to founding Kingsway at, I believe, 27, and now being the president at the TON Foundation. So if you would connect the dots, like what has been the common thread for you over all these experiences?
I'll try to keep this short,
Yes.
but my basically first goal in life was number one, to make the world a better place, and number two, to make a lot of money. And I quickly realized each of those are difficult, individually, let alone together. So I needed a plan. The first part of the plan was to, swap the order around, probably the right call. And the second part of the plan was to get some inspiration by people who've done it and done both. And I guess the good news was, and this is, me as a teenager growing up in the Black Forest in Germany, that, number one, there are lists for this sort of stuff. So you could look it up for both topics, I guess. And number two, that the top spot on both lists wasn't the same person effectively. Now, of course, you can debate, whether being the biggest philanthropist is, the right proxy, but maybe not a bad one. And so the good news was, I guess, it was mutually exclusive. The bad news was I couldn't invent anything useful. And, Bill Gates was number one at the time, and I couldn't, code or, wasn't as creative. So I had to settle for second or third best and came across Warren Buffett, the investor. And I, didn't understand much at all about investing either at the time, but I understood one aspect of it, which was compounding, right? If you basically, can generate and sustain very high investment returns for a very, very long period of time, you actually don't need to start with very much. And that suited me well because I had no money whatsoever, but I had a lot of time. And so I guess I made it a one-dimensional problem, just focusing relentlessly on generating, sustaining high investment returns. And, I went down the rabbit hole of reading everything about it. And then I got very lucky. I got a full scholarship at the LSE, London School of Economics. I'd never been to England and, got sort of out of my comfort zone there. And my scholarship benefactor was a Greek airline billionaire, the founder of EasyJet, which is a low-cost airline known to Europeans, a bit like Southwest in the US. And I guess I was a curious case who was, the Greek was paying for the German. I've reminded him that we've returned much of the favor by now, but in all seriousness, it was a huge stroke of luck because being, during these formative years during university and college in London, basically allowed me to follow my interest and passion around, sort of business, entrepreneurship, and investing, not only in theory, by reading it all, that too, but really in practice, working with and for practitioners every, summer, but every 3 minutes. And this is how I got into what we now call traditional finance. So, did a bunch of internships, Rothschilds and investment banking and private equity at Fortress and Blackstone. My second year, I spent, so 2 days a week working for a long-short equity fund called AKO Capital, which was run by a bunch of Norwegians, the founder of which is now running the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Nikolai. And I ended up joining Goldman Sachs for my sins. This was in late 2007, I signed my contract. Goldman was on top of the world, and I didn't join the investment banking part, but the sort of internal proprietary investing team, which was sort of the rainmakers. And I had a humble start to this career. 9 months later, Goldman almost went bust. It wasn't my fault at all, but I think in hindsight, sort of connecting the dots with the financial crisis in the system also definitely had an impact. And then I was an entrepreneur eventually. So after all, sort of 3 and a bit years at Goldman, I decided to start my own business. And look, I don't have a superpower, right? But if I did, it was the ability to find investment opportunities in rather obscure corners of the world and markets, frontier markets back then, and blockchain today, or even like 5 years ago, right? And then to sort of understand the investment opportunity in a pretty concise way and explaining it succinctly and basically raise capital to go after it. And so that's basically the genesis of Kingsway, where we had initial success in, we still do that, frontier emerging market equities. So that's not, China, God forbid Russia. We have a bit of India and Brazil, but we're really interested in Bangladesh and, parts of the Middle East, Africa, or Latin America, or CIS countries. And then we got into venture, which led us into fintech, which led us into blockchain, basically. And maybe I'll pause here.
That is, that journey, thank you so much for summing it up. That's just an incredible journey. How did you, because I guess I think the EasyJet founder is Stelios Hagiannis, right?
Correct, yes, yeah.
How did you, Sir Stelios, yes, apologies. How did you make that connection? How did you get him to sponsor your LSE university?
And to be honest, there wasn't much magic in it. I also had the Studienstiftung, which is you will know as a, almost a German. So there's a national scholarship program in Germany, which is more, let's say, immaterial support, nonetheless, huge honor. And the LSE scholarship really came about because you basically, I'm the middle of two brothers, and sort of from a modest middle class household in southern Germany. University was free at the time, as you might know. And my parents said, "Look, you're going to get the same budget as your brother in Berlin." And he was getting like 200 euros a month or 300, something like this, right? And that didn't go very far in London. So you basically had to apply. And, I know the process, of course, from both sides now. My wife and I, we've given, well over a dozen scholarships ourselves to the school. So I haven't forgotten, goal number 2, making the world a better place, right? But, the university basically assesses the application. And then, there's a number of scholarship donors. He was one of them. This was the first year he was doing it. And there were a couple of criteria that he liked. The fact that I was, sort of already showing entrepreneurial streaks. I started my own business when I was 18 back in Germany, not worth talking about, but I kind of mentioned that in the application. And so yeah, we were very, very lucky that I was selected. The truth is, I probably would have done fine in Germany, but I wouldn't have never, basically probably studied in London and started my own business this way, and never invested in Animoca brands or Toncoin, right? So definitely, I think I think the Steve Jobs sort of commencement speech at Stanford, when hindsight sort of the dots connect, I think is quite apt, and I definitely feel that way, and hence also we're giving scholarships ourselves.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, yeah. Because as you said, very humble beginnings from the Black Forest in Germany to all of this. It's not a place where a lot of big founders come from, I would imagine.
It's true, but at the same time, I've seen a lot of poverty in my life. Again, we own 1.5% of the Bangladeshi equity market, and I can tell you, growing up in Black Forest is just fine, right? We still have what I would call a lot of first world problems there. But yes, look, there's, I think, I try to keep all the good bits of my German background and identity, these sort of, work ethic, discipline, and, basically doing what you say you will do, right? Reliability. But yeah, it's not been historically a place for huge entrepreneurship for a number of reasons we can go into. Europe, arguably as a whole, has suffered from a sort of lack of permission for ambition. Hopefully that's changing now. And I think also, blockchain is, of course, a huge part of or an opportunity for this, right? Because it's not historically at all a Silicon Valley thing, or, of course, Coinbase is from Silicon Valley, but, that's, while it's a very big public company, it's, a fraction of the size of some of the Asian exchanges, and, most of the unicorns in the blockchain world, actually, Asia is a good example where you guys are based, or, sort of, not necessarily all from the US, quite the opposite, actually. And so I think Europe has a great position there potentially, and I think European founders are given sort of a level playing field in a way that didn't exist before.
Where do you see, because you're talking about macro and Europe's position, how do you see Europe's position in the future then developing when it comes to the crypto war, more or less the blockchain war, because there's so much adoption in Asia, in the US, as you've seen, obviously, now with Trump and everything.
Yeah.
You feel
it's kind of a wine conversation, right? I'm a proud European in many ways. I think we definitely have, of course, the talent, and we have certain advantages, right? That we're not the global economic superpower or global reserve currency, and we are clearly the leader in regulation. For crypto, actually, that's been a good thing, right? Because Mika actually has been offering regulatory clarity basically a lot earlier than now. What of course now the US is sort of maybe overtaking us there on the left lane, right? But so I think Europe should be in a good position. There's very strong engineering talent, especially in Eastern Europe, or in France. To some extent also, of course, in Germany or Scandinavia. Gaming has been always good in Scandinavia, right? I just worry that we have also had some setbacks, right? I mean, we're gonna maybe talk later about the legal situation in France around Telegram's founder Pavel Durov, but I would say it's not our proudest moment in Europe in this aspect, but we're definitely hopefully going to make a positive contribution, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
100%. Let's see what the future holds for European founders. I think in a recent interview with Raoul Paul, you've spoken a lot about emerging markets, and I want to dive a bit deeper there into your passion for emerging markets. You mentioned that emerging markets aren't really poor because of laziness, but because there is no way to store capital, historically speaking, right? So was that the light bulb moment when you were diving deep into emerging markets in Africa or Southeast Asia that really pulled you deeper into Bitcoin and then eventually TON?
I would say yes. I mean, I've always I guess, had a sort of soft spot for the underdog, if that makes sense, right? And sort of, I've always wondered, like, why are certain countries like less prosperous than others, and what happens if they develop, or how do they develop in the first place, and so forth. And there's a lot of academic literature on this, and also I think from an investing or entrepreneurship standpoint, right? It's important to be a good athlete, right? And my biggest day one investor was a gentleman called Howard Marks, the founder of Oak Tree Capital. And he said, if you, want to win any game, sports or investing, you have to be a good athlete. And you're a great athlete here, Manny, but there's so many others. Just as important, maybe more important than being a good athlete is to, choose a game that's stacked in your favor and sort of avoiding the competition. And, for him, it was buying, basically junk bonds, where Moody's said there's no price, not even 1 cent on the dollar one should ever pay for what is a non-investment grade security, which of course is a whole lot of rubbish, right? You get yield, you get recovery, right? There is a price, and by the same token, pun intended, frontier market equities or venture, vast majority of global capital wouldn't even touch this with a barge pole at any price, right? And of course, that's again probably mistaken. And the same with blockchain, right? This is like the ultimate frontier market, right? These are, I think even Fidelity published a piece that these are like frontier emerging economies, right? Like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and we can talk about Balaji Srinivasan, who I'm loving dearly, and he's been an inspiration about the network state. I would even raise him the network continent, right? And yeah, I mean, look, the obvious insight was we've had pretty much in every country we were in, to varying degrees, huge amount of currency headwinds. Basically, we had problems with the local fiat currencies. If you're investing in businesses which grow very, very fast in local currency, and then the currency halves, well, you're kind of back to square one, right? And sort of that, I think, primed me much better than most people from the West, let's say, who haven't really had these problems to understand first Bitcoin and then the power of other layer one blockchains like Ethereum, Solana, or Toncoin, and the power of stable coins. And so it's sort of like hiding in plain sight, so obvious to me that this is the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, kind of thing, right? And frankly, that's been playing out, right? I mean, like already like 5 years ago, some of the largest penetration sort of markets for blockchain technology were I think maybe 18 of the top 20 or something like that were like frontier and emerging markets, right? The first country who adopted basically Bitcoin as a legal tender is El Salvador. You can debate where that sits, but probably a frontier emerging market, right? And I think the light bulb moment also was actually meeting people like Yat, right? Yat Siu from Animoca, who explained sort of the meta idea to me that this is really about digital property rights, right? At the very sort of highest level. And the reality of the matter is that the vast majority of people living in countries which sadly don't have very good physical property rights, right? Let alone good fiat currencies. And we are even here sitting complaining about the dollar, the British pound, the euro, and maybe the yen, right? But like the Nigerian naira or Zimbabwean dollar, I mean, that's a whole nother
kettle of fish, as the Brits would say. And so yeah, I think it's one of the biggest things. It's really the biggest part of the solution in my mind, right? I mean, look, Bitcoin's not going to make you taller at basketball or cure cancer, right? But if it provides basically American style, property rights to the globe, to the vast majority of people who don't have them, that could really make a huge dent into poverty reduction, right? Because yes, I don't think people are poor in these countries because they're lazy or stupid, because in my experience, most of them are not lazy or stupid at all. I think they're poor because they've got basically only labor working for them, not capital. There's of course two inputs, right? And the little money they make from their labor, right? Sometimes it's like $2 or $3 a day. They have no place to put it other than fiat currency cash of the worst kind, right? If you're unbanked, and there's roughly 3 billion people in the world, largely living in these countries, who are unbanked or underbanked, you don't even have interest, let alone stocks, bonds, gold, or real estate. And now, for the very first time in human history, the poorest people in the world can choose and are choosing some of the same stores of value in cyberspace that the richest person has chosen. I mean, Elon Musk is on the record. I mean, he probably owns the US dollar, right? And dollar stable coins are widely popular, unsurprisingly, right? He owns Bitcoin, he owns Ethereum, right? And, I'm sure we can convince him, hopefully at some point, to own TONcoin, right? And so I think this is really going to make a huge dent into poverty reduction. I'm here for it, right? And it's almost also poetic in a way. And even Saylor talks about this, right? How this technology finds the people first who need it the most, basically. So and yeah, I think that's also sort of from a sort of equitable standpoint, actually a good thing, right? I mean, the richest people, of course, also get into this, but really it's from a, I guess, need to know basis, much less important to them compared to the global poor and unbanked.
I agree 100%. Very well said. You also often shared Alex Gladstein's work, which really resonates with me too, because a few years ago, I actually had an interview with him for the German edition of Forbes, talking about talking about China's social credit system, because I was studying in China. So I know that his ideas deeply connect to the bigger story of free freedom of speech and free capital markets. And do you think TON really is in that movement, so building the property rights into that digital layer?
I mean, I'm glad we have a lot of time now talking about these sort of super intellectually interesting topics, rather than just TONcoin, which we'll I'm sure get to. But look, I mean, Gladstein or Alex has been an inspiration. I mean, when I got into this, and because how I got into this, right? I didn't go into this because I was like a crypto bro or a cypherpunk or a gold bug. I got into this because I was, maybe one of the largest actually private sector investors when it comes to these frontier and emerging markets. And his work has been a big source of inspiration. I met him first in the, I think, Miami Bitcoin conference, must have been 2021, the first one after COVID. I read all his work, check your financial privilege. I would highly recommend to everyone on this call who has, financial privilege, probably everyone, including, of course, our selves here. And really also explained how, people like Warren Buffett, and, I'm a huge fan of Warren Buffett. He's been, again, inspiration. And I've been to Omaha many times, really are not well, sort of situated to get it right yet. And of course, old people sadly have a habit of no longer changing their mind after a certain point in time. And I don't want to be judged by my worst moments, so I'm not going to judge him by his, but I think he's wrong on Bitcoin, right? And that's okay, by the way. So yeah, I think, then, the other important point to mention about Alex Gladstein is that, he has been really leading coming at this from the, not even like a sort of business standpoint, but, he's a human rights activist, right? And he is the chief strategy officer of the Human Rights Foundation, HRF, which, for a very long time, really since I think 2013 or 14, has been accepting donations in Bitcoin. And of course, has been working with activists from these countries that I'm pretty familiar with. And the Oslo Freedom Forum is, actually one of my favorite events of the year. So I've been going sort of religiously to Oslo every May, June when they have it. And we've been sponsoring it as well. Pavel Durov spoke. He was not allowed to travel there, would you believe? The French said no, no human rights conference, please. But he zoomed in, and And it's mostly, I would say, more of a Bitcoin maxi crowd, which we can also talk about, like how I see that. I mean, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, but I think the case for Bitcoin maximalism is actually quite strong. So I'm more of a freedom maximalist, right? And we can talk about the nuances there. But I think what the maxis are sort of doing is like tough love, right? They're just warning everyone from the sadly large amount of scams that exists in the industry. It's like the Wild West. But I think it's actually very compatible to be, saying Bitcoin is my first love, which I like to say in this space. But I also think, US dollar stablecoins are a pretty useful onboarding tool, right? And that is actually what people want in the global South. Like I can tell you, like I've been there pretty much, 8 out of 10 countries I've been physically, right? And that's not many people have, right, from the West. And I think you have to be pragmatic as well. And I think then of course he's also exposed a lot of stuff about the sort of IMF and World Bank, right? I mean, that's again a spicy topic. Probably won't go into it myself, but he has a point. And I think the thing I would say basically about this question, right? Why Bitcoin, yes, is sort of maybe, if this is chess, the end game, right? Like for the sort of solution for in terms of being the best savings instrument for the global poor and unbanked. It's like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think the problem with Bitcoin, as we all know, it's basically not built for mass adoption on layer one, right? I mean, the sort of UTXO sets is not enough, right? Like if you really want 1 billion people, or let alone 3 or 8 billion people on it, like it doesn't work. Like you need maybe layer 2, like Lightning. I'm one of the world's biggest investors in the Lightning ecosystem. We invested in Lightning Labs. I mean, this is of course from Kingsway's perspective, right? And maybe a dozen or more than that other Lightning companies, like you name it, right? The problem with Lightning is, sadly, and this is again, as the biggest Lightning investors, like no one really uses it yet to any like large degree. And I think hopefully we can also plug Lightning into Telegram, right? That's sort of part of the plan. It's little known that Pavel Durov is basically was able to retain 100% ownership of Telegram the way he has, for a lot of reasons. But one of them was that he bought Bitcoin very early, and was able to use his basically Bitcoin holdings to fund the development of Telegram, and without raising equity, right? And so he's a Bitcoiner, like I'm a Bitcoiner, but I also think stablecoins are very useful, and as stablecoins need to run on something, right? And also I think perfect should not be the enemy of the good, right? And I think you need, if you want really mass adoption, you need to make the user experience very easy and intuitive. And I think Telegram is very much in the pole position to deliver that. And then look, I also believe in digital property rights at large, right? Like and this is sort of I think where Animoca comes in, right? I'm sort of like I personally, at least for now, don't yet invest in physical art. I might change my mind on that, but I haven't done it, right? But it turns out a lot of people do, and so I also haven't really much invested in digital art either, but a lot of people do, right? And I think clearly owning your stuff in cyberspace is sort of better than not owning your stuff, right? And I think gaming is a huge part of this. I mean, it's the biggest source of entertainment for humanity, right? There's over 3 billion gamers or so, and it's growing. It's bigger than film and music combined, right? And there's something like 150 unicorns without blockchain, right? And the reality of the matter is, right, gaming is just the most obvious application for the technology digital property rights, right? And basically the reality is there's 3 billion people who are unbanked, and how many people actually own a piece of physical property, right? Like literally everyone. Like people in Africa, in the Philippines, in North Korea, they own a pair of shoes, right? The clothes they're wearing, maybe glasses, a watch, God forbid, a phone, a bicycle, a scooter, a car, a house, right? So close your eyes. Like 10 years from now, everyone online, there's what 8.0 8.5 billion people going to 9.5 billion, right? There's 5.5 billion people who are on the internet. That's growing. And there's only 400 million people or so who own a piece of digital property, basically us pioneers in crypto. And that will basically grow to, pretty much, I think, everyone more or less on the internet. And of course, a lot of the digital property will be fungible tokens, whether that's stable coins will be huge, clearly Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, TON coin will be huge, but also non-fungible tokens, right? I mean, the majority of sort of value, as far as I understand it, in the physical world sits in unique assets. In every single flat, house, or piece of real estate is, even if they're in the same street or same building, is unique, right? Every single car, you can go through the list, right? And so I don't think it's far-fetched to say that there's going to be a huge amount of value also in what we call non-fungible tokens. And even if they're not useful to you, that doesn't mean they're not useful to a lot of other people, right? And in Telegram, you're seeing this, right? You can own your username, right? And I own @Manny, right? And no one, neither Pavel, Durov, nor Telegram, can take it away from me. They can bid for it, it's a voluntary, it's freedom, right? Exchange. And you can own your phone number, and you can of course own your any other NFTs on the TON blockchain. Gifts are becoming huge, right? So I'll pause here, but this is clearly a rabbit hole.
Yeah, you dove into a lot of really interesting things here and topics. We'll get to the gifts and everything that you can do on TON itself in a second, but maybe really let's fast forward to today then, from Bitcoin and the early inception of all the emerging markets that you invested there with Kingsway, and your passion for freedom of speech and digital property rights. So you stepped in as president of the TON Foundation with a specific focus in the US. What would you say has been the biggest challenge in turning the 1 billion users that Telegram has, where it is obviously uniquely positioned to be in that situation? What is the difficulty or the most biggest challenge to actually turn those 1 billion users into active TON users, of the active blockchain users?
Yeah, I'll answer that, but let me also first, riff on your first point about freedom of speech, right? Because I really, believe the founding fathers in the US really thought about this, right? Like, there's of course many different freedoms, right? And but I think freedom of speech is sort of the most, the first and most important one. If you cannot basically say what you think, you basically you don't have basically truth, right? You don't have people who are able to be honest and able to, let's say, freely criticize, free to assemble, free to transact, voluntary exchange, and even property, you could argue, is the freedom to use it exclusively. And there's a quote by one of the founding fathers, I forgot whether that's Jefferson or someone else, who said basically property rights and freedom are basically inextricably linked. You can't sort of have one without the other, right? I don't think you can have property rights without freedom of speech, and you might not be able to have freedom of speech without property rights, right? And so I think this is really fundamental, right? And this is sort of what I would call America in cyberspace, right? And I call it Satorica, because the reason why America is called America is because of this German map maker who happens to be from my village, and no one knows this story. Trump didn't know that story when I met him, and everyone knows about Vespucci, right? The Vespucci named it, which is true, I guess. You're quasi-Italian, or at least with an Italian name, but the person who named it was actually interestingly this map maker, and so I call it Satorica, and I think if you believe that this is sort of America in cyberspace, right? John Locke, life, liberty, property became life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, by the people, for the people, from the people, right? What Telegram really does, its role, is the First Amendment. And, that's huge, if you think about it, right? And what TON then does, it's basically the property rights layer within that, America in cyberspace. And the way I say America, it's the continent, right? You have, of course, North America and South America, right? You have, in North America, you've got Mexico, you got the US, you got Canada, you got a bunch of countries in Latin America, right? But I think Telegram, and TON is probably closer to what I would think is the US, like in terms of like I'm not belittling any other blockchains here, right? They're all going to be the United States of Satorica, right? And of course, Bitcoin in my mind is actually the denominator, if that makes sense. We will measure the value of everything, including TON coin, in Bitcoin terms eventually, when all said and done. But I think clearly Telegram is hugely important like hugely important, right? Which is also the reason why I take this so seriously and have, reluctantly agreed to sacrifice my well-earned privacy to do podcasts and be on Twitter, X, which, I've never done before. And I don't do lightly, right? I mean, but it's more important than me or anyone. And look, I mean, I've been involved in TON now for something like 3.5 years. I was on board of the foundation from more or less inception, and then I was asked to become president, really late last year in Q4 24, and then was announced in January. The truth is, it was a bit like a George Washington kind of situation, as I think mentioned on another podcast. So George Washington did not want to become president of the TON Foundation, of the United States of America, right? And the same for me. Like I had other options in life, right? But eventually, it was sort of like a TINA, there is no alternative situation, and I of course take this very seriously. I do it pro bono. I don't want any compensation from the foundation. And the clear task was to, bring in a leadership team on the executive basis, which I've done. Max Crown is our very talented CEO. He is a co-founder of MoonPay, German, very strong operator, very seasoned, both on the regulatory side, but also in certain verticals. Of course, payments is a big strength of his. Has done a wonderful job, and have high hopes for the future. And he's of course expanded the leadership team there, and then really bringing the US market entry to bear. That's ongoing, right? But the backdrop is, which TON is special for many reasons, right? I mean, first and foremost, the exclusive partnership with Telegram, right? But secondly, it is the kind of only large layer one that has sort of avoided the US on purpose. This was a self-imposed, regulatory restraint under Biden-Harris, and maybe the right call, right? You should never risk something you need for something you want. And now, of course, that's changing, right? And if you think about also the performance of TON, just to put a snap commercial there, I think it's underperformed for at least 3 reasons, right? I mean, overall, as altcoins have underperformed Bitcoin. And I think in hindsight, the key reason for that is, you can argue this is normally how the cycle goes. But I think in this specific cycle, what Bitcoin had and the altcoins didn't have until quite recently is what I would call the institutional bid, right? You had the Bitcoin ETF, wildly successful, but maybe even almost as important or more important, you had the treasury companies like MicroStrategy, right? And you didn't really have them in altcoins until quite recently, right? And of course, now I'm running one, so we'll talk about that. Now, secondly, all the sort of new money into crypto, a lot of it at least, seems to have come from the US since the Trump election, and TON is not available in the US yet in true fashion, which is also changing, right? And then thirdly, of course, there's been a situation in Paris, which I think will be resolved, and that's another catalyst here. But to answer your question, Luca, so basically the challenge of converting a messaging user to blockchain user, is, I think, first of all, a more surmountable challenge than converting just a random person to a blockchain user, right? I mean, it's helpful if you're already using the product, right? And you suddenly, there's a wallet, right? And you can, of course, use Telegram as an onboarding tool to TON blockchain. And the TON wallet, which sits inside the app, since it was launched, I guess, properly, what is it now, 24 months ago, it's already onboarded over 100 million users, right? And arguably without trying as hard as we could have done. And that's without the US, which just launched last month. And so I think this will, in all likelihood, become the biggest crypto wallet in the world, even if it isn't already, right? And this is of course, nothing short of that is the ambition. Now there's a variety of things you can do, right? I mean, what we've learned is just popping it up into the settings menu is one thing, right? There's a big debate about making it opt-in versus opt-out. The wallet has basically been opt-in, right? So if you are new to, if you just are a Telegram user, you don't have it, right? But then, of course, you can, basically make it opt-out, that everyone has it by default, unless you on purpose click it away, right? That's something we haven't even done yet, right? But is a possibility. Pavel feels very strongly about, again, freedom and doesn't want to force anything on anyone, right? Including the wallet in TON blockchain. But then again, we definitely think about discoverability there. We also found, and of course that's something where you guys have huge amount of experience in sort of creating, I would say, let's call it sort of off-chain use cases like Notcoin or other tapping games that then are being put on chain, in short order. And you could argue gifts are actually something similar. Has been very successful. I mean, I'm of course, big fan and longtime supporter of Animoca Brands. From a Kingsley perspective, we've been an early investor there, and we saw blockchain gaming again picking up early in the Philippines, right? Because we are, we tend to look at the Philippines, right? Most people don't, and Axie, basically exploded in sort of Q4 2021, and it made a lot of sense, right? Why it happens again. I think this is so misunderstood, right? Where people say, well, the game is not fun. And my kind of polite response is, I know what you mean, but relative to what? Is it more fun than cleaning the toilet in Manila? Yeah, I get it. Okay, yeah. So this is, and of course, it's true that there is no way around making these games, as good or even better than the best non-blockchain games, and that's kind of happening. But I think initially it's, again, check your financial privilege, quite misunderstood, and so basically I think insight though was, right, in the 2021 blockchain gaming cycle. I'm sorry, actually blew up in late 2020, right? This is actually, I was wrong by a year. We invested around that time. I think Axie peaked at something like 2.7 million MAUs, right? And I think it was valued at 45 billion for 1 minute, which is kind of nuts. But what happened on these Telegram tapping games, and again, they're not fun, right? Relative to what is my question. You could add 1 0 or maybe 2 zeros, right? I think Notcoin grew from 0 to like 40 million users within like 2 or 3 months. Like the curve was actually faster than ChatGPT, which launched around the same time. Now, of course, I wouldn't compare Notcoin to ChatGPT otherwise, but and then of course you've seen other ones from Catizen and dogs and hamster and so forth, right? And I think this has actually been a useful onboarding tool for the wallet because you need to give people a reason to use the wallet. And the sad reality is, many of these frontier and emerging markets, people actually don't have money, so they need to earn it. In the West, people can buy it, but in many countries, they want to earn their crypto and then put it somewhere, right? And so we've seen a lot of activations there. Now, look, and there's one last example I'll mention is WeChat, right? Which again is not as well known in the West or in the US, is worth a case study, I think. Now, how did Tencent become Asia's most valuable corporation at the time with a peak market cap of $1 trillion? And the investment stories are nuts, right? I mean, my good old friend Zhang Lei from Hill House, right? In I think 2004 or 5, put like something like 30 million bucks into Tencent and didn't keep all of it. But, he told me the story. Now he's like the second biggest asset manager in Asia after SoftBank. And Naspers, now called Prosus, right? Which is a legacy media company from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. They literally had like cable TV and newspapers and stuff. They put 30 million bucks into Tencent around the same time, and they became, I think, peak market value of that $30 million investment was like $180 billion, like a 6,000x. Now it took like 15 years, but name me an investment of that scale that then has been better. Like this almost puts anything to shame we've seen in kind of Silicon Valley almost, right? And you had, of course, WeChat in the middle, the messaging app, right? But then, we don't have them in the West. We call them super apps, right? Imagine all the other, especially financial applications, granted no blockchain in China, but you had digital money market funds, leftover treasure. The WeChat one was called from WePay, which is like Athena for us, like a yield-bearing dollar account, right? And payments, of course, mobile payments in China are 200% of GDP, like from zero, right? Like, much, much bigger than anything that whatever Visa and MasterCard do, right? Like, and then of course, all the gaming, right? And so this is really, I think, possible here to build like a sort of quasi-decentralized global or Western WeChat, yeah. So that's I think going to be really, really interesting, right? And what WeChat did, they did something. They turned like a very popular offline use case in China that was giving red envelopes full of money around Chinese New Year, and and they basically did this. They digitized that, right? And I think one Chinese New Year, I forgot which year it was, they had 50 million activations in one day for what is now WeChat Pay, right? So, why don't we do blue envelopes? And the way it would work, right, is to set up like, I'm like an ambassador or whatever. I send you a blue envelope. Of course, I would only send it to people who don't have the TON wallet yet, right? And I don't know what's in it, and you don't know what's in it either. And if you open it, both I and you get split the bounty, and it could be, of course, TON coin at its basic form. It could be, maybe like gifts or something that Telegram created at more or less zero marginal cost. But I think that could be sort of interesting onboarding sort of viral mechanics here.
I think that is a very good point, the comparison with the super app in China with WeChat and Tencent. I mean, I remember when I went to China and studying there, and I saw these QR codes everywhere. It doesn't matter how small the shop was, but you saw these QR codes. And I think a lot of people in the West, in Europe, in the US, forget how big WeChat actually is and how big Tencent is, how all-encompassing that app really is, and what are all the things that you can do in it. So you would say that TON is really heading towards that super kind of app role as well.
Well, I think Telegram is, right? And TON is, of course, the economic property rights layer that everything runs on, right? Yeah. And of course, it needs to be said also that, Telegram with TON inside it is actually much better than Telegram without TON inside it, which already is the best message in the world, right? But like, you can do so much more with it, right? And the point I'm sort of trying to hammer down is how big this really is, right? Again, having, seen what happened with Willows and Tencent and Naspers and Tencent, or folks who bought basically the second biggest backer of TON, who kind of brought me in, and who wants to remain anonymous, but they bought 10% of Facebook, now Meta, 1 billion at 10, and Silicon Valley thought they're nuts, right? They effectively invented what we now call late stage growth equity, right? And it was still a 100-bagger. Now, again, I don't think everyone kept everything, but mathematically, you got a venture return with more, I would say, late stage growth equity risk, which is kind of what TON is. TON, you could argue, is $1 trillion animal hiding in plain sight, and it's valued less than it's $1 trillion animal valued at less than 10 billion, right? So, and I think it's much less likely to go to zero, like some early venture investments we all have made. And you can debate whether the outcome is $200 a coin, which roughly would peg it at $1 trillion, or cut that in half twice, but it's still pretty good. And I think it's really worthy studying the WeChat case study, right? And also Elon is trying to do the same thing with X, right? To turn X effectively into a sort of social media, but really also fintech crypto super app, right? And Telegram is 50% more users than X. So yeah.
I think there was a recent partnership as well, right? Or a proposed partnership
it's
between X and
between the goats.
Yes.
I was shocked that Elon clearly is the greatest of all time, the GOAT in at least hardware, right? I would say Pavel is the GOAT, the greatest of all time in software, right? I mean, he's the only living human being, right, who's built an app that not only 1 billion people use every month. There's maybe 5 others, right? You can argue sort of Zuckerberg, maybe the WhatsApp founder, although they sold. Ponima, again, it was kind of his team, but still. But the only one, Pavel, is that's built an app that 1 billion people use, and that who owns 100% of it. And I think there's quite a lot of similarities, and of course a lot of respect mutually between Pavel and Elon. Because I think, it's sort of like, Elon doesn't want to go to Mars to make more money, right? Well, of course, SpaceX needs to be a 100 billion, a 300 billion, ultimately $1 trillion plus, enterprise value business to make, everyone basically really wealthy who risks their capital or, spends their time on the mission. But the mission is actually to make human consciousness multiplanetary, right? And the mission, is arguably bigger than sort of the business, and Elon combines it, right, in a way that is quite unique. And the same is true for Tesla, or Neuralink, or the Boring Company, or X and XAI. And the same is true for Pavel and Telegram, right? What is his mission? Freedom of speech, freedom of exchange, and privacy, which privacy is also hugely linked to freedom of speech and freedom overall, right? And then, of course, banking the unbanked. But freedom isn't free, right? The mission has to be financed. And, Pavel is more pure than Elon in my mind, that he didn't even want to raise equity, right? Even from an aligned VC like me, to have even a modest amount of pressure being put on him to monetize in what he would consider the unethical way. He never wants to, violate your privacy, take all your private data, mine it with the AI, sell it to the highest bidders, including all the governments, show you invasive ads, which is kind of what, the other guys are doing, right? No, he wants to monetize the honest way. What is this? Subscription, right? Voluntary, right? You get, more features for $10 a month, right? So me and 16 million people are paying that. I think it's one of the largest and certainly fastest growing sort of, subscription products in the social media world. He's done a non-invasive ads platform put on TON rails, right? And that respects user privacy. He's done a bond, but really TON is by far and away the single most important puzzle piece of the entire global monetization of Telegram. And also the first billion is the hardest, right? It's not like, in my experience. So Telegram's not going to stop, or Pavel. 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, maybe even 4 billion, right? And I think if you compare Elon and Pavel, like the two dimensions where Pavel might be better is, focus. Of course, look, you can give it to Elon again. Like, how can he run 5 or 6 different, companies the way he does? And I think the only answer I can see is at a huge personal price and cost. He's not entirely in shape, it looks, right? And I think he, just to say this with all huge amount of respect, I'm not in shape either, right? But like, Pavel is ripped, right? He doesn't even drink caffeine, let alone alcohol. 8-pack, and the second is commitment to the mission. Actually, Pavel has said he's willing to die for his mission or go to prison for 20 years, and he's got troubles in France right now. But Elon said he's willing to die on Mars, but not on impact. The point is not this. You can debate that both are extremely committed, right? And look, I sadly can't talk much about the partnership. I can just say that yes, they are on speaking terms, and yes, they have both something the other needs or wants, right? Elon sadly cares a lot more than us, blockchain people about AI than about blockchain itself right now. Though of course he understands that they're also linked in a big way. And as there's a race, and you can argue he's behind, right? Sam Altman and OpenAI, and I think there's a personal vendetta there as well. And Elon doesn't like to lose, right? Especially not against, a sort of nemesis. Pavel, on the other hand, I don't think will ever have enough money to build his own, whatever gazillion-dollar foundation model. Maybe doesn't need to because, there's open source stuff and, and maybe his brother will come up with something. But, Elon's got Grok, right? So why don't we put Grok into Telegram and put TON into X and see what happens? And yeah, I hope that will happen eventually.
Yeah, I will hope that as well.
It's
and I
beyond
think
my favorite, so I can't say much more other than see what's in the public domain and on Twitter, X, and take your own conclusions. Yeah,
100%. But I totally agree with the fact that Pavel has just always been so focused. And people who know Pavel, with everything that he's been doing before in Russia and the social media network he founded before Telegram, he has always been committed to his vision from day one, and it's all out there, right? So that focus and that dedication,
sacrifice more than people can appreciate, right? Like, it's incredible. Like, I don't think there's a more committed entrepreneur or founder with a higher capacity to suffer and more mental fortitude than Pavel Durov. And his ethics, I think, again, of course, he's always been, very unjustly accused of high Russian asset and like what's going on, and but it's pathetic in a way. Literally, he has survived assassination attempts, and not too long ago, right? Like not in Russia, outside Russia, probably from the I don't know, but looks like it could have been the Russians, right? So to accuse someone of that, I think is extremely cheap.
And also then I think maybe one interesting point that a lot of people forget, Pavel is also super young in a way, right? So he still has a lot of time.
1984, George Orwell, very fitting. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, no, he's 41, and just getting started, arguably, right? And so there's another 20 plus years, hopefully, or more ahead here, and so he's relentless.
Maybe let's talk about the distribution. That is such a key aspect when it comes to Telegram and TON. So let's say if you compare TON and Telegram to other ecosystems specifically, would you say the distribution is the key pillar there, which makes such a big difference?
Absolutely. I mean, yes. I always joke with Yat, who basically told me, Manny, content is king, which is why we want to own all the content. And look, and this is, of course, borrowed from Bill Gates again in the late 90s, who said that content is king when the internet came first about, right? And who am I to disagree with Bill Gates in the late 90s? Of course, I also believe that content is king, right? But distribution is the queen, and she's wearing the pants, at least in this household. And the point is, you want both the content and the distribution. And I think in the age of AI, the content is slightly more at risk of being commoditized than the distribution, right? And no one has the distribution that Telegram has. I mean, it's not quite true, of course. There's 5 apps in the world which are bigger than Telegram in social media. Let's go through the list and ask the question, which of them are doing blockchain, right? You got WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram, not allowed so far. Again, let's see whether they go back in the stable coins. Would be actually good news in my mind. Would validate our thesis. But Meta has 400 product managers. Zuckerberg is not one of them, apparently. Telegram's got 1 product manager, and it's Pavel. And then the other 2 are 2 Chinese ones, right? You got Tencent WeChat, we talked about that, and ByteDance TikTok. Not allowed to do blockchain either. So excluding those 5, you got Telegram. It's the world's biggest. That has done it. It's live. It's deployed, right? And even if you're Elon Musk, right? You look at X. What happened? You kind of need to talk to Pavel if you want, that distribution, right? Because if you want access to Zuckerberg is not going to help any other AI player, nor any other stablecoin player. He will just do his own thing, right? And so if you want access to the world's largest open distribution, which is Telegram, you got to talk to Pavel, and you got to, build on TON and integrate TON, right? And so that is really, I think, the huge opportunity here. And distribution is, you know this from gaming as well, right? Like, Animoca, we're huge fans. Again, I think, Kingsway owns just under 10% or something. That makes us maybe the largest outside shareholder, right? Ahead of Neom, the Saudis, or, other very, very deep-pocketed investors, right? But if you want a game with like 100 million users and it costs you $5 per user, that's $500 million. I mean, there's a lot of money for, even all of us, right? Like, and if you have Telegram, I mean, you can basically plug it in, right? And I'm not saying it's easy, it's not, right? I mean, but like, it's a lot easier than just starting from scratch without the messenger. And it's also not like Ethereum or Solana will, huge respect for those guys, huge respect, right? I think, again, everything will get bigger. I can talk about the interactions there. We're friends with them, we're helping each other. But like, I don't think they will build their own messenger. Or if they try, they won't succeed, and catch up with Telegram.
I really like that analogy of distribution is the queen and she's wearing the pants. That is a very good way to put it. That is a very good way.
I think
yes,
Perelman.
How does it work in terms of like attracting developers on TON? Because that's basically how you grow an ecosystem, having developers building cool things. Is it the distribution there and just basically telling them, look, if you want to build something cool, build it on TON, we have the distribution? Or are there hackathons, grants? Like, how does it work?
One of the areas I'm personally the least happy with what we've done. Now, the good news is, again, long-term, there's no concern, right? Because, the developers will go where the users are. And this is not a blockchain thing. Think about like iOS and Android, right? If you, Luca, and me, Manny, wanted to have the bright idea of launch our own new mobile operating system, and we can build it, right? When we go to the developers, please build on ours. What's the first question? How many users do you got? Like, if the answer is 0, well, see you later, right? And so clearly, no one wants to build an app for an audience that doesn't exist, right? But that's theory, right? And in practice, we still need to do it, right? I would say we've done a decent job in the developer ecosystem east of Berlin, right? And that's not just CIS, that's also Asia. Like, we see a big influx actually from WeChat developers. And that's actually, again, worth double clicking because, that's not as familiar to probably the Western audience here. But the Chinese, Communist Party has a habit of sometimes changing the rules, right? Gaming was huge on WeChat, and it's still big, but I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago when they decided to kind of turn off the monetization, right, a little bit, because they decided, as a matter of national the security, I guess, they didn't want the Chinese youth to spend 4 hours a day on their phones gaming, right? And it made monetization much, much, much harder for game developers on WeChat. Now, what are the game developers on WeChat that doing, right? They're not like, going become dishwashers. They look around, right? What are the other alternatives here? Oh, there's something called Telegram. And even if it's not like big or, even perhaps allowed in the mainland, especially not with blockchain, there's a huge wide world out there that, we can have mini apps, which is very similar to what WeChat has. And so Telegram mini apps is like 500 million MAUs. And you have, monetization on TON, which, is better than monetization without blockchain. We can go into the math, but it's like the difference of renting versus owning. It could be between 10 to 30x better. So let's go, right? And as you know, the good news is, of course, for all its flaws, the CCP has a white paper and is actually pro Web3. Of course, especially in Hong Kong and outside the mainland, but also has allowed, of course, Web3 developers based inside the mainland to build Web3 apps, for basically abroad. And some of the, I think, most successful game developers on TON on Telegram have actually come from the WeChat ecosystem. And there's a lot going on there, and really big numbers actually, and good success. Now look, I'm here to basically address also, of course, the US audience, right? And TON is, of course, making a decisive market entry in the US, which has many pillars, right? I mean, the most obvious pillars are listing on the leading US spot exchanges, which hasn't happened yet, right? But I have full confidence that will happen. Of course, Verb, the premier and only, and hence biggest TON strategy company, which I just basically willed into existence, is a big part of this. We're listed on NASDAQ, right? Open to US retail institutional investors, pretty much for the first time, of course. It's also like the only way to basically not only get access to TON, but really to like Telegram indirectly, right? And Telegram is not, playing in the world of Ethereum and Solana. It's like Meta and Tencent and Snap and X and ByteDance, right? This is maybe not a Mach 7 company, Telegram, but it would be maybe like Mach 15 or 20 or something like this. Like it would be big. But look, the developer push is also, really, really important, right? The arguably, most talented Web3 developers in the world, and certainly in the Western world, are based in the US, and we haven't done it yet, right? And I think there we need to also take pay our respect, and maybe a playbook of, Solana, I think, is executed maybe the best in making the developer experience, documentation, and tooling, so seamless and so easy to build on. And I think, again, it's a bit like the challenge is like making good blockchain games, right? It's a question of, capital and talent and time, and we have all three, right? And then it's really execution, right? And that's really going to be a huge focus. So all the developers who are listening to this, we're open for business. And if it's hard to build on TON, let us know why, and we'll fix it. And what we can give you is, again, access to a billion user Telegram user base, right? And so and I think that's quite unique. And I think, again, I don't have any concern that we will succeed, but I do think it's something we need to double and triple down our efforts on.
Very well said. I think I want to double click on TONStrat. So obviously, congratulations on launching that. That is a very big milestone. Could you just summarize maybe for the audience as well, like what is the strategy of holding TONCoin and of TONStrat, and how does that apply to what you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I mean, look, this has been quite a ride. I mean, I have other plans this summer. I'm currently in Portugal with my family trying to have a holiday, but it's not working. This was an idea. I mean, of course, we had it like, a while ago, but really from start to finish, we pulled it off in like less than 4 weeks to what is now over $1 billion market cap company listed on the NASDAQ, right? And kind of to take a step back, right? Of course, it all starts with the underlying. We talked a lot about TON. I'm not going to try to make an even more compelling case there, but that's, of course, a given, right? I would never do this with a coin that you don't believe in, right? Because that would be very foolish and risky. But clearly the sort of segment, I guess, has been pioneered by Michael Saylor. And I've known Saylor for something like 4 years. I went to his 100K party this past New Year's in Miami. And he figured out, I think, at least two things, and maybe only after the fact, right? So the first key insight here is that, that wrapped in a company, at least certain digital assets and, well thought through and structured, trade at a basically premium to book. And we can debate why that is, right? I mean, a simple mind in me would say there's maybe 100 times more capital that can buy US equities than can buy coins. And that's true even for Bitcoin or Ethereum or Solana. And whatever the number is, I don't know whether that's 100 times, it's just a wild guess. You can add 1 0 probably. It's like 1,000 times or so for TON, right? And I think, which if you believe that line of argument would mean actually we should trade at even higher premium to NAV, right? Because of the scarcity premium. Now, secondly, which is maybe perhaps less intuitive and a bit more technical for the non-finance audience, but there's a huge distinction between a permanent capital vehicle, the holy grail, or an ETF, right? I mean, Warren Buffett, in, I guess, the 60s, right, figured this out, that permanent capital is really the way to live your life. And Berkshire Hathaway is of course, been his masterpiece there. But, if you sell the ETF sells the coin. And if you sell shares in MicroStrategy or BitMine or Verb, TON Strategy, the coin stays. Now, look, the shares can go down. That's not the point, but the point is the coin stays. Permanent capital. And what this means is you can, of course, trade at a premium or at a discount, but you can do something about it. You can issue stock or other securities or buy back stock. You can stake. And that's actually a huge advantage over the Bitcoin treasury companies, which I want to double click on later. And you can be included in an index, right? And the ETF can do none of these things. It can't, issue stock or buy back and keep its coin. It cannot issue other securities. It cannot stake. It cannot be included in an index, right? And the name of the game is actually growing book value per share. If you just decompose, MicroStrategy, Strategy's investment return, and keep in mind, right, the core business is mediocre at best, right? And it didn't matter. The stock has outperformed NVIDIA in the AI boom in the last 5 years, something like 34x return. And that is after dilution, right? That's literally the stock return. But if you decompose that, roughly, Bitcoin is roughly up 11x. So that's a third. And 2/3, 23x, came from capital allocation. And so that's the majority, right? And so then you look at the altcoin treasury companies. Again, I would like to maybe highlight the leader BitMine in Ethereum. They've delivered something like a 15x in now less than 50 days. Outdone Saylor at being Saylor, right? Now Ethereum is doubled, but again, if you decompose 15x, 2x Ethereum, 7.5x capital allocation, right? And the name of the game is growing, a book value per share. Now, the way you grow book value per share, the simplest form, and this sounds, too good to be true, but you issue basically, this of course only works, right, if you're trading at a premium to book. And we can also talk about, what happens when that stops and why it might stop, right? But if you're trading at a premium to book, let's say 2 times book, you're issuing stock at book and you're buying coin at book. You issue stock at 2 times book and you're buying coin at book and you're growing book value per share. So it's not dilution, it's sort of, accretion or dilutive accretion, you want to call it. And so now if you keep doing this, and of course, BitMine was very extreme, right? They had a minute where they traded at 9 times book. Now, if you issue stock at 9 times book and you buy coin at book, you double your book value per share with 10% dilution. You do it twice, quadruple your book value with 20% dilution. Ethereum goes up 25%, 5%, so and this can happen very, very fast. And it even makes sense to, especially in the early innings of a company like this, to pay a premium to book, because the growth, the compound growth and book value per share growth will, dwarf any sort of modest compression in the premium. And And so here's what we've learned, Luca, right? And again, I think there's a lot of unsophisticated players, with all due respect, in that space as well. So I think it's really worth, getting a sort of minor PhD in the DAT, digital asset treasury game. So we've learned this is actually a winner takes most game. And you can see this in Bitcoin, right? I mean, Saylor is 30 times bigger than the number 2. And by the way, this does not mean that the number 2 or 3 can't perform well. They can, but I don't think they can catch up with Saylor. And the reality is there's a massive sort of scale economies in especially raising capital, especially the cost of capital, which of course is the inverse of the premium that you trade at. So the game is to maximize the spread between return on capital and cost of capital, right? And of course also there's scale economies in the speed of raising capital and the size of it, right? And it reminds me a bit like building Kingsway in my late 20s, right? Where I was, very, very fortunate to raise $1 billion before I turned 30. Now, look, I didn't make $1 billion before I turned 30, but I know a little bit about building an asset management business and the benefits of, also pitfalls of scale, of course. But like generally, it's an institutional, almost like investment management style business, right? And capital allocation is really important. The Web 2 or the sort of pre-blockchain Bible on capital allocation is a book called The Outsiders, which you guys should all read. Will Thorndike, there's a new dimension now with Coin, but he's an investor in Kingsway and a friend. So it's a winner takes most game, right? And I think the winner should trade at a higher premium, and maybe also that there's an advantage that compounds over time, right? And as you know, in Ethereum there's a race, right? And Bitmine is ahead, but there's Sharplink Gaming, right? Joe Lubin, co-founder of Ethereum, and ex-Goldman, right? And there's Ether Machine, and there's 5 or 10 others now, right? Solana, there's a race. In TON, there is no race. So far, at least, there is no second best TON treasury company. And by the way, that doesn't mean we don't welcome others. We do. We absolutely do. But I think it's going to be very difficult because if the others are also raising capital and buying TON coin, and also building not only the capital flywheel to do so, but the sort of marketing, PR, media flywheel, great. But I think it's going to be hard for them to catch up with us, and that's fine. We welcome others, but we kind of would like to stay and be the winner, right? And compound this advantage over time. Now, the second thing I'd say is that I don't think there might be an ecosystem that eventually, and it hasn't happened yet, right? Because we're just getting started, but that might end up having a bigger ecosystem impact from the digital asset treasury phenomenon as TON. And I can just explain what I see, and you can criticize that or but when how big was the impact of Saylor in Bitcoin? It was meaningful, right? I mean, without Saylor and his disciples and followers, I don't think Bitcoin would be at 115K. It will be high, right? I don't know, but it had probably could be 20%. I mean, something like a lasting impact, right? And of course, you can also see the impact of Ethereum already by the treasury companies, right? I mean, this has arguably been the key narrative this summer, right? And it's supply demand, right? But as you know, Saylor has basically hodled through the bear market and invented this stuff and issued securities that none of us had ever heard of before, like perpetual preferreds, to basically barely get to 3.5% of the Bitcoin supply, right? And of course, all hats off, right? Huge achievement. And Bitmine, big, hairy, audacious goal, get to 5% of Ethereum. That would be the dream, right? That would be something that we could all, rally behind as our North Star. We already have more TON coin as compared to as percentage of supply than Saylor has Bitcoin, right? So we'll be able to get to 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%. So I think we can be more aggressive than the others if we choose to do that. And I don't see a reason why we wouldn't, even if we haven't really started with that yet. Leaving some room for others to join the party first. But I think this will be only understood in hindsight. And it will have been obvious in hindsight, right? So maybe I'll pause here.
So actually, in a way, what you're describing now, which is super fascinating, I think especially when it comes to that side of the business, a lot of people don't really know that because they're just looking at the tokens itself. Or now, as you said, with Bitmine, they're just catching up on what's happening to Ethereum and how that impacts the price as well. But would you say basically that is what TON is right now? What you're doing with TONStrat is kind of like the Michael Saylor moment back then for Bitcoin in a way?
In a way, yeah. Just even maybe more extreme because, our relative size of our, listed company is compared to the TON market cap is much, much bigger than Saylor ever was or is today, right? And the same is true in Ethereum, of course, right? And again, like imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? And we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, I don't think Saylor had much of a plan other than, rescuing his sort of business. And it was a move of desperation, as you know. But he didn't go into this and say, okay, I'm going to file for an ATM and I'm going to issue premium stock at a premium to book. I'm going to do convertibles. This all came later, right? And Bitmine had more of a plan, but even they were sort of maybe, more lucky than smart. And by the way, like, Seneca said, luck as preparation meeting opportunity, right? They were prepared, but they were able to issue, had an ATM ready and then issue a stock at a premium to book when they did. And it's worked wonders for them, right? But it's much faster, right? Again, like, I think, you can compress the time frame basically a lot. And of course, I'm not here to give financial advice at all. This stuff is risky, and like, if you want to, know what you're gonna, make or lose by fixed income, but like the reality is, right? I think the token, of course, should benefit in general, and this is one of many things, right? There's, just if you think about supply demand. Of course, on utility, there's all the users, right? There's the centralized exchange listings. There's the DAT. Listco, but then if the token performs, the stock should perform better, and it's just math, right? And by the way, this only works in the bull market, right? Like, if you believe the bear market, this sort of reverses, that the premiums compress to first zero, then to discounts, then the stock will do worse, as MicroStrategy has done in the bear market, right? And so it has higher volatility. Now, Saylor would say volatility is vitality, right? And I tend to agree, but this is something I think that's not well enough understood. I mean, it's shocking when I talk to US stock investors. Like, they of course they've heard of Telegram, right? But they haven't heard of TON. What is it like? Do you eat it? and then they certainly haven't heard of our stock. And this is now also the reason why we're so public about it, because we want to give US investors, retail, institutional, the chance. And by the way, everyone can also buy it in, like, from abroad, right? More or less with, apps like Robinhood and stuff. So to basically get a chance to, participate in this, potentially generational value creation event that is ahead of us here. And so yeah, the entry, I mean, the train is sort of leaving the station is sort of my message, right? And I'm gonna, be as succinct as I can to try to explain this in plain English. But for me, it's quite obvious, actually, if you really think about it and break it down.
Yeah, if you break it down, it makes a lot of sense.
Just one point on staking, Luca, if I may, right? So
yeah, of course.
The Bitcoin companies have a bit of a problem because they have no native yields, right? And I do worry, right, that some of them won't resist the temptation to reach for yield in the Bitcoin ecosystem, which you and I know, and Gladstein knows, that the yield is the friends we make along the way. Right? There is no risk-free yield in Bitcoin, right? And that could be problematic because they have costs, right? I mean, there's some costs, I can tell you, right? Running a public company, with people, with lawyers and service providers and offices, it is travel, is not for free, right? Now, and this is, of course, not unique to us or TON, right? But, the Ethereum guys have yield, the Solana ones have yield, and we have yield, right? And this is, again, where the scale really matters, right? I mean, think about an investment management business for a second, right? Now, it makes a difference if you have 100 million AUM or 10 billion, right? You have 100 times more capital, but you don't have 100 times more cost, I can tell you. And if you start at 10 billion and you halve, maybe there's a 50% drawdown, maybe there's a 75% drawdown, you halve again. You're still profitable here, ish, right? no bonus, right? Not a great year, but you can still keep the lights on and pay your people. Like, you're starting with 100 million and you half and half again, you're like, maybe lights up, right? And so not only do you have massive scale economies and cost of capital and raising the capital, but also in staking, right? And if you think about it, right? So imagine, we don't want to eventually just be a treasury company. I think, this is, of course, the way we start, but not where we end up, right? And where we end up is we're going to have, of course, staking, right? And you can do the math, right? The yield is somewhere between, call it 4.5%. Already on these numbers, it's not a secret given there's public filings, you can look it up, how how many hundreds of millions of coins you already have, right? And so basically, this should be like, over 30 million bucks of revenue, right? And of course, it's paid in TON. If TON goes up, revenue goes up, right? No, it works the other way. And of course, you want to keep the sort of, cash costs like pretty low. Running a tight ship. I mean, Telegram is famous for running the tightest ship in the world. 1 billion monthly active users with an engineering team of like 30, 40 people. It's kind of nuts. But certainly that's the ethos, right? And I think we need less people than Telegram has, of course, much smaller operation. And then what else are we going to do, right? I mean, well, why don't you end up owning your staking infrastructure, right? As you know, when you stake, you pay away, I don't know, 20% if you're small, 10% if you're big, gross to net yield to like a staking provider. Why don't we, if these are 7 figures going to 8, like why don't we just keep that, right? And that's not that complicated. And then why don't we do delegated staking, right? Where, Kingsway and, Sequoia and Benchmark and Ribbit and all the others, TON coin holders, Pantera, right? They have a lot of TON coin and they're also shareholders here. So why don't we keep the coins in our custody, wherever, is our trusted custody provider, but we do delegated staking in the Listco, where the Listco earns the gross to net. So suddenly you have not only like balance sheet with a multiple, right? Hopefully, but also a cash flow statement also with a multiple, double that, right? And then even better, right? I mean, I can promise that this happens, right? And I can't promise if it happens that it happens through our company, but let's just say it's been discussed, and let's just say Circle trades at a pretty high public market multiple, right? Why don't we do a stablecoin? And this is Manny math, right? But hear me out. Like, imagine $1,000, right, in your bank account. Even for the average sort of demographic of the Telegram user base, $1,000 on average. There's rich people, there's poor people, right? But $1,000 in your bank account isn't an insurmountable amount of money. If 1 billion people have $1,000, it's $1 trillion AUM business at 3% net interest margin (NIM). There'll be 30 billion of cash flow a year. Even if you were to pay half that to Telegram, which is 15 billion, Circle Coinbase, that's probably what you would do. There's still $15 billion of cash flow left. So maybe there's not only $100 billion company, but a $200, $300, $400, $500 billion company eventually, right? And again, this sounds crazy, but like, give us like 5 to 10 years, right? And that's like, how many chances are you going to get? Is my question. And I think this is the biggest one.
I think this is a first. I think really like what a lot of people, like that old proverb, like a lot of people overestimate what they can do in a year, but they underestimate what people can do in 5 years or 10 years.
Compounding.
And I think this is exactly what you laid out there very, very nicely. Yeah. Very exciting times then.
We would like to explore where you guys could help us. Maybe we want to, because Telegram is such a global footprint, and actually it's so big in Asia, and India is the largest market and so forth. Like, why don't we do dual listings? At least we explore that, right? I mean, it's not that easy. I've got my own experience with this, but like, would love to, maybe have a dual listing in the UAE, right, or in Hong Kong, right, where there's other pools of capital. In the UAE, you might be able to get a sovereign to anchor this. I mean, from my experience in the UAE, and I've got a decent amount, they want to grow in their own domestic capital markets, right? And then we're going to make it very attractive. Telegram happens to be based in the UAE. So it makes sense to consider at least a dual listing. It needs to be fungible. The liquidity doesn't need to be bifurcated and stuff like this. But that could be, of all these sort of so-called treasury companies, we could be one of the first ones to actually do it, right? I know MetaPlanet is thinking about stuff like this, or Naka, in slightly different fashion. But I think that could be really cool. And I think given Yat's position in Hong Kong and his sort of advisory role to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and as the leading figure in Web3 over there, that could be an interesting part of the narrative as well.
100%. That could be definitely something very interesting that could be figured out. I think as we're moving closer towards the end of the podcast and the interview, I really want to also double down on one recent phenomena that we've seen with TON and Telegram, which is the gifts and the stickers and all of that. Because obviously now, I think the last couple of months, even the secondary volume on stickers on TON has been higher than OpenSea, which is absolutely wild. And all of these phenomena when it comes to digital collectibles around TON and Telegram, is there any specific IP that you're mostly excited about or really excited about when it comes to that specific vertical of what TON is doing in Telegram?
No, it's a great question. I'm glad we're touching on this. It's not given enough attention, I find, given how big this is already and could be, right? I mean, the first thing I'll say is, Luca, that if you look at the sort of big picture, Telegram is the largest untapped monetization surface in the digital world for IP and celebrities, of course, Snoop Dogg's gift launch was just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, they launched now a couple of collections, and it sells out typically within, if not seconds, within minutes, and it's so tens of millions of dollars in a drop, and that's just Snoop Dogg, right? And so there's of course a queue of other celebrities or IP owners, right? You could do this with football clubs. You could do this with any sort of valuable IP that is out there, and that's kind of the plan. It happened really organically, to be honest, and again, a bit like the WeChat red envelope example. Like, who doesn't like gifts? I mean, you like actually not only receiving gifts but actually giving gifts if you're a generous person, right? And of course, there's many occasions, right? There's imagine how many birthdays are in a year, right? If there's 1 billion people on Telegram, there's like 1 billion birthdays, and then there's Valentine's days, and there's religious holidays from Christmas to Diwali to Easter, you name it, right? And so it's also a great way to onboard people. Like you find someone, hey, why don't you check this out? Here's a gift. Okay, great. And weddings, like you name it. And so I think in hindsight it was obvious that gifts are going to be big. And again, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. I don't want to single out a single kind of IP there. I would welcome, all the big existing blockchain. I mean, like, how big was the NFT craze in 21 for Ethereum? It was huge, right? I mean, there was absolutely, it was like tens of billions of dollars, like in a very compressed time frame, in an arguably very mediocre at best UI UX environment. And so I think this could be absolutely huge, and is one of many examples, right, of the sort of superpowers that TON has with Telegram's integration. But the challenge is, again, like, what do you allow, right? So on one part of the spectrum, right, which is where we are now, only Telegram today can issue primary gifts, right? And that is to not only control the user experience, but also to make sure that people don't just put a swastika on chain, right, and so forth like this, right? Which I know is what happens, and so the other end of the spectrum is you could allow everything, right? Everyone could do it, and then of course you have IP violations, and that could be problematic. So I think where we're going to end up is probably in the middle, where we're going to have approved IP owners or aggregators of IP who also are real entities you can pick up the phone to, and they will be allowed to basically bring IP and work. But I think it won't just be fully Wild West. And again, it's not my decision. This is well above my pay grade. But I think it's a bit like Notcoin, where roughly 1/3 is still off chain, 2/3 is on chain. But of course, eventually everything should be on chain. And I think that's clearly the path we're on. And I think it will surprise people how big this is in terms of potential. And it's hopefully going to resurrect. I mean, it already has to some extent, the sort of global NFT world, right? Where really it's again about really user experience and user interface a lot, right? I mean, look, I'm a good example, right? I love blockchain, clearly, but I don't want to have a bunch of seed phrases flying around everywhere and have a MetaMask wallet here and bridge to this chain and pay gas fees. I want to press buttons and expect it to work. The way I use the internet, if I use the internet, or my mother, which she does, she doesn't know nor care which protocol is running in the background, right? Is it TCP/IP? Is it HTTPS? Is it Linux? No, you press buttons and it works, right? And here you hop into your Telegram, linked to 1 billion people, now linked to a wallet, right? You hop into a game or send people gifts, and it's literally like one click. And I think that's kind of the solution, right, to the long, well-known problem that the user experience was just very, very bad, sadly. And we need to hold ourselves as an industry to much higher standards. And it's not just like 10% better; it's like 10x better, right? That is required for mass adoption. So I'll pause here.
No, beautifully said. I feel like because I work a lot with creators and KOLs in the space, and what a lot of people and I discussed is similar to what we felt, the emotions that we felt during 2021, 2020, during the whole NFT hype. That is what the TON ecosystem felt like with stickers and the gifts quite recently.
Yeah,
So it's very nice to
absolutely.
have a resurrection of that feeling.
Yeah, and it's been totally organic, right? I mean, this is just sort of happening, and people are collecting gifts, and there's some really rare ones. Plush paper is like kind of or Durov's hat, and I think it's hugely exciting. And I think the also when you imagine you can link this, which happened in 21, right? You could link your NFTs to your Twitter back then profile picture. Why not do that on Telegram? Already the usernames, by the way, are also like extremely. I mean, like imagine. There's people out there, right, who are smart, right? And there's one guy who said basically, "What? This cannot be taken away from me. I want to own all of them." And someone who's deplatformed, like in the actually NFT 2021 cycle, right? But like, I mean, if you want to own Luca at Telegram, you can. It's going to cost you like a nice bundle of TON. But I would think like imagine how many Johns and Peters and Yacht better position. Like there's not many yachts, right? But like, so I think owning usernames, and then of course you can own other ones like at bank or at crypto or at blockchain. You can own Animoca. I mean, it's like almost like the domain names back in the day, right? And I think it's going to be super valuable. And these things, they have actually outperformed the token, maybe unsurprisingly, right? Because they're measured in the token itself, and then people are waking up to this. And so I think the sort of monetization surface there is huge, and of course let's not forget the mission, right? I mean, like it's really important, I think, for people to own their stuff, right? I mean, property rights are, again, having studied, maybe it's a good way also to find a closing sort of paragraph here, but in this whole academia that I've studied, right, all the books about Lindström's and Steele is one of the early ones, and then The West and the Rest by I think it was Neil Ferguson. But I think the best one is probably by Osmoglu, and I forgot the other author, but it's called Why Nations Fail. And of course, Why Nations Fail is also explains why some succeed and prosper, right? And it's all about the institutions, actually. And most importantly, the institutions that protect private property. The Mystery of Capital is another great book about this, which also explains it's all about property rights. If you don't need democracy, which is a controversial thing for me to say, but Singapore is a good example. You could argue mainland China is a good example, right? Which arguably doesn't have democracy, at least the way we understand it, but has property rights and institutions who protect the property rights, which is why again TON blockchain is so important, right? Because code is law, right? And basically, it doesn't matter whether you are an entrepreneur, a salaryman, or an investor, right? If you want to basically be sure to retain the fruits of your labor, investment, or work, or entrepreneurship, right? Whether it's sort of communism on one hand or arbitrary dictatorship on another, it's not a good model, right? You don't need democracy, but you need property rights. That is really, I think, so important. And it is, I think the difference between North and South Korea, between East and West Germany, and this is, I think, gonna grow the digital economy by an order of magnitude. I mean, digital economy is already quite large, right? There's a couple of $1 trillion companies and so forth, but no one actually owns anything digitally, right? You press purchase, you buy the Apple iTunes movie. Now it turns out to be a lie. You can't basically buy an iTunes movie and send it to me for free or for payment or rent it out to your friend, right? Well, you can watch it twice, 3 times, 4 times, but what you're doing, you actually are renting it. And and when you lose access, which is what renting is, right? Read the terms and conditions, it's gone. And the same is true for every in-game item, every Fortnite skin, right? And now if you actually like infusing digital property rights, like the difference between renting and owning, right? And I don't know where the yields shake out, right? But in London, like we used to rent at a 3% yield, right? Which means the ownership value of that property is 33 times the annual access fee, which is what rent is, right? And so the inverse of the rental yield. Now we look, the yields could be 10% and it's 10x or 5% and 20x. Who knows? The yields might be high, but
I'm not so sure though, because, in my experience, actually, digital property rights are better than physical property rights in at least, some important dimensions. Now, granted, you can't live in them, right? So there is less, let's say, shelter. but, right, you can basically sell your digital property by pressing a button on a Sunday, sitting anywhere in the world, right, on your phone. Try this with your digital physical property. Have you ever tried to sell a house? Or even and now you can also use that liquidity, right, to do fun DeFi stuff. Like you can borrow against it, you can do, generate yield. You can, of course, take self-custody. You can cross borders. The weather doesn't impact it, right? I mean, physical real estate is like, maintenance capex is high, right? And it's harder to steal. It lasts forever. It doesn't pollute the planet. Maybe it's a good idea, especially in countries which don't have good physical property rights, which, by the way, is the vast majority of countries in the world. I think, according to Gladstein, you can debate this number, but probably 2/3 or so of the global population lives basically, so 2 out of 3 people, right, lives in countries with very mediocre at best physical property rights, and so this is going to happen. Nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. But it's people say, well, what if Bitcoin goes to zero? And what if the reality is you cannot unsolve a math problem, in my experience. Bitcoin solves a math problem, Byzantine generals problem, right? And so we cannot just now all go back and pretend we don't know the solution when it's open source, right? It is going to be very profound, and I think it's, in my mind, maybe as profound or more profound even than AI. I mean, AI is going to, of course, converge with blockchain, already happens, right? But this is so big that my 9-year-old is, I'm not sure whether she's gonna have much of a bank account ever, right? So anyway, I'll stop my rant, but I wanted to give you a parting gift on this.
No, 100%. This is beautiful to see, because obviously we're all about the true digital ownership rights. Right. And I can see why you and Yet connected so much back then, especially on that topic.
I helped you to understand this at the beginning. It was because you need to unlearn so much stuff, right? What do you mean, I don't own a PDF? But you do, but it's information can and is being copied for free, right? There's no way for me to send a PDF to you and you to send it back to me that I know you no longer have it, unless I trust you that I deleted it. And so the people haven't really thought about it, and I was to blame as well. And so I think there's still an education to be done, hopefully, and thank you for doing these podcasts, right, which I know is a lot of work, to educate people what's coming, right, because it's going to be fundamental knowledge, right, to not only survive but thrive in this new brave new world, right, because the sad reality is, in my mind, I feel like coming a little bit from the future. And I think Argentinians also say, we're from the future. Let me tell you how 10% inflation per month looks like, right? This is, there is no alternative in the West, sadly. There's a good old healthy depression, but that's not going to happen in Western democracy. So what they're going to do, they're going to print, right? And, if the, unstoppable object, hits the irresistible force, right? Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk tried to doge the United States government federal budget, right? And whose reputation is intact? They're going to print, and it's sad, but that Ayn Rand said you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequence of reality, right? And people have to basically now look out for themselves, right? And own assets that can't be printed by the central banks and governments and so forth, right? And then people complain about, only Bitcoin is 100% finite, and terminal supplies 100%. Sorry, only Bitcoin has a terminal inflation rate of 0, right? And so forth. It's true, right? But TON coin has, I think, 40 bips of annual inflation, which is not 0. It's not Bitcoin. It's not trying to be, right? But 40 bips is a lot better than the US dollar, which has 7% a year, or the Zimbabwean dollar, right? And so, and also Apple stock isn't finite, by the way. They can make more of it, and they're printing it, all the time, right? Stock-based compensation and so forth, right? And of course, you can buy it back. But the point is, I think people need to really wake up and understand this, because their future depends on it. And I do worry that there's going to be big winners and losers, right? And I think again, we have a job to do, to educate folks, especially folks who are not technical, and not sort of focus on it, sadly. But anyway, I'll pause here.
Very beautifully said, Manny. I think maybe just as a last closing thought, let's say we sit down again in 3 years from now. What would you want people to say about TON? Like, where do you hope that TON is, that Telegram is, that all the work you've been putting in with TONStrat and the TON Foundation? What do people say about TON in 3 years from now?
I mean, the most important thing to me is that, and I think Pavel is a very good example, right? That we will have done the right thing. And the right thing, it's hard to define, right? But in my experience, it more often than not is putting your own interest below the greater good. Pavel is taking a lot of personal risk and sacrifice to do what he believes to be right, even if it doesn't suit him and cost him dearly, right? Like, again, for me, it doesn't suit to be doing podcasts on my holidays or become the president of TON Foundation or, again, of course, look, there's, of course, always, we're big investors here, right? So we're also financially incentivized, but, what's the old saying? Like, never trust a sort of a thin chef, a fat personal trainer, or a poor investment manager, right? I was modestly successful before getting into blockchain or into TON, right? But my point is, like, we want to be able to do that. We want to be, I think what I want is people to say we've done the right thing. I think that's probably most important to me. Our, I guess, ambition is nothing short of being the most, widely used, impactful, and ultimately, of course, make no mistake, most valuable blockchain project in the world after Bitcoin. Look, even if we don't succeed at that, hopefully we can be proud of ourselves. But I think we don't like we like winning, right? There's going to be so much winning, you'll be tired of winning. And if truly believe this is so important, as I just hopefully made a passionate case for it. And mass adoption is really the prerogative. And if we can't do it, I don't know who can. Sort of, I mean, if we don't succeed at mass adoption, Luca, like, I think we have a problem. So this is really, I think, also a bellwether type of project for the whole industry, right? Like, if we can't make this so easy to use that my mother can use it, I don't see who else could. And look, I mean, let's see, right? I'm also gonna, part of me sees a future where it's actually gonna be, a whole step change where actually, like, Meta does it in a different way, right? They're gonna have a closed version of this, and let's see what X does and so forth, right? But there will be a bit of a clash as well, right, between the existing Web2 giants who now, it'll take them a long time, and they have a massive sort of innovator's dilemma and sort of a cannibalization of their core business, especially around advertising, to protect, right? But and again, in history has shown that generally you want to own the disruptor, not the disrupted. I mean, some of the newspapers have been, they still exist, but like it hasn't been that pretty, right? And so I'm not too worried about it at all. But I think it will be there will be sort of almost like fake digital property systems who are like closed systems, right? And they will pretend they're open, a bit like Apple today pretends that you own you buy your movie or your song, which is not. I mean, you can argue it's a lie, right? It's liberal with the truth at best, right? And I think we got to have a real alliance there between the good guys and sort of the the not so good guys. I mean, I always like to joke that what sort of the Web2 giants have done, this is getting borrowed from Yacht maybe, they've built sort of North Korea in cyberspace, right? So not only does Zuckerberg have the audacity, right, not to share any of the value that you bring to Facebook, Luca. Like, if you are using WhatsApp or Instagram, you're bringing probably, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of value to Meta shareholders, right? I mean, the easiest way to understand it is like, what value would Meta have with 0 users? I would argue kind of 0. And so every user brings value, some a lot and more than others. But not only do you get nothing of it, so it's communism. Even worse, you're being spied on like in North Korea. What we're offering here is American cyberspace, Satorica, right? I mean, you spoke about Gladstein earlier, Oslo Freedom Forum. I've met North Korean dissidents. There's not many of them who actually made it out alive, right? It's like hundreds or so. And it's pretty crazy. I mean, like, if you hear the stories, like literally, Like right now, right, there's some poor but arguably brave souls who are crossing the southern border from Mexico into the US. And, I would argue they're not coming for the food or the weather. They're coming for the property rights, for the economic opportunity. And actually, last time I checked, Mexico was kind of a nice place compared to like North Korea, right? So again, like I'm not afraid that we're not going to win or like this is not going to happen. But I think it's there's going to be I think at some point like different kind of like competition or alternatives. The Web2 giants are not going to go without a fight, and frankly, there's also still it's not entirely clear to me how the governments will now react to this, right? I think clearly the US and its current administration is fully on board, and I think that makes sense. I've said for the longest time that whenever met Americans about blockchain in the Biden-Harris era, that Winston Churchill will be proven right, that America will always do the right thing, but only after all other options have been exhausted, right? And that's where we are now. But we might see a backlash, and we're seeing already, I guess some, and there might be administrations in the US which will be less friendly to the industry. And again, Europe needs to make a decision as well where they stand. I think China is of course I think quite well prepared and still being walled off on the mainland, but let this proliferate outside. And I think there's going to be like quite and then couple that with AI, right? Like in 5 years and 3 years, the world will look very, very differently. And I think a lot of people will have to make trade-offs, right? The AI people all have to make trade-offs, right? Like, do you want to do the right thing? Like, put your own interests below the greater good? Or do you want to like be a megalomaniac and own the AGI first and control the whole thing? And I think that's sort of why I answered this question with doing the right thing.
Doing the right thing. What a powerful note to end the podcast interview on. And I think it also really connects so nicely with your initial goal of like your childhood goal of like making a lot of money, and then swapping out the order of changing the world. And in a way, I'd say this is a very close call to changing the world.
Yeah, and it's like the good thing for the first time in my career, it feels like it's not so much either or. Look, by the way, there's worse things I could imagine having done than investing capital, whether it's primary or secondary, but even secondary capital in poor countries, that's probably not a bad thing, right? These countries need capital, but it was not as direct, I would say, as an impact if you really can. What did Steve Jobs say? Like, do you want to sell soda water or change the world? And I think the doing the right thing point is going to be very, very important. So from that perspective, we should not forget, why we're doing this, and also once people have had initial success, like stay humble and stack sats. I was joking, when I said like, oh, I want to make a lot of money. Like I never asked myself the question, what is money? Until I was like 35. And I think most people have never asked. There's a great show called The What Is Money Show. Robert Breedlove, I'm a big supporter and fan. And I think that's one of the most important questions of our time, right? What is money, right? And the answer is shockingly unclear for even money managers. So and tells me we're still so early, Luca, so early. Incredible. Even smart people, right? Like you go to I just had a friend who came back from I think it was Sun Valley, and like this is like in tech. Like how many people actually own even Bitcoin? Like maybe 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10. And they own like a little amount, and so it's so early, like it's shocking and exciting. Yeah,
very, very exciting. Thank you so much for the conversation, Manny. That was a very good conversation.
The longest one I've done so far.
Very happy to hear that.
Really pleased to be partners. Like you guys have been amazing.